Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm blessed to be joined by my dear friend Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, legal analyst for EWTN News, director of the Conscience Project. As usual, follow her work at conscience-project.org, and she's also on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Bayer Picciotti. Andrea, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great, Marcus. How are you?
I am well. I am well indeed, and it's always good to reconnect with you. Although I was just informed that you are in my neck of the woods.
I know we are both in the mitten, and it is glorious time to be in the Midwest, that's for sure.
So let's talk about what's going on with the United States teachers. So I think even before we begin, Andrea, I've got a question, which is why did we come to a point where we started believing that teachers, especially teachers part of unions, had greater rights to freedom of expression and speech than the average American? What happened to us?
I think it's just a general and good instinct that ours is a nation of freedom, right? And so we think about the freedoms that we have, especially the First Amendment freedoms, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And we think that that applies across the board in the workplace, if you're a government worker, especially, and we don't realize that there are some nuances to that. And the education setting is probably the one where people are most ignorant, not willfully ignorant, but just not knowing what the law says and what the role of our teachers are. And that in many ways, that's a good thing. It has its disadvantages, but it also has its benefits as well. So, this is the idea to talk about this came because there was a Catholic woman in Scotland, Sarah Morse, who was serving, she's actually an American, serving as kind of a floating substitute teacher. And her students, teenagers, as are prone to do, were asking her lots of questions, and they asked her her position on abortion. And she said, well, I'm a faithful Catholic, and so I oppose abortion, and, you're free to come to your own conclusions. And shortly thereafter, the same day, she was terminated, and she's challenging that termination. And it got me thinking, really, what do we know if the same situation happened here in the US? And how is it different? And how is it maybe less favorable for a Catholic teacher? And so I got to studying a little bit more about the law. And I'm excited to talk with you, Marcus, about kind of the ins and outs and the challenges that our American school teachers are facing.
I'm really glad you brought exactly that up because there is a distinction that we want to make sure our listeners understand, and that is the difference between how we can think about American law and our constitutional freedoms, or at least the enshrinement of the freedoms that we've been given by the Lord in our Constitution, versus British employment law.
Yeah, no, and it's very interesting because when it comes to the First Amendment, just First Amendment in general, we have much more freedoms of speech here in the United States than in kind of the UK in general. We do also have a lot of freedom of religion here, not only in the First Amendment, but in federal laws, in state laws. Usually, though, our freedoms are a check on the government. They're also to make affirmative accommodations to religious belief. But in general, it's the idea that the government needs to be kind of restrained from trampling on kind of our God-given rights to belief, to conscience, to expressing our own views. Things are a little different in the employment context. And the best way that I thought to kind of wrap my own head around it is when you're in a job, you're basically representing the company that you work for. And if that job is a public job, if you're a public employee, you're representing the government that you work for. And so the government can put limitations on what it is that you can say and what it is that you can't say. And you can be disciplined for going, I guess, the best way to say it, going off script. The challenge is when the discipline maybe is going to be one-sided, right? So that if a public school allows a robust exchange of ideologies, but doesn't allow for traditional religious belief. And that's kind of what was going on with Sarah Morse in Scotland. And I think it's coming more and more often with religious teachers in public schools and learning how to navigate that where, the protections of the Constitution aren't going to be there if you're on duty in the classroom and supposed to be teaching social sciences. You don't really have the luxury of free opinion sharing as you would if you were, in the public square debating issues.
I'm really glad that you brought up that very key distinction here because the Constitution does in fact enshrine the limitations on the government for the freedom of speech, expression, especially worship and religion. But it's remarkably silent when it doesn't talk about freedom of speech and expression with regard to jobs.
Well, and that's where the Supreme Court often comes in, right? And they've had a couple of cases that I don't particularly like, but I can see how they're good for the order, I guess. And one of them was dealing with a government employee and their political speech. And that employee was disciplined, terminated. And the Supreme Court said, look, when you are a public employee, you're speaking for the government. And if your speech is going at odds with either the government's position, or you can imagine you're speaking poorly about an elected official that you work for, you could be disciplined because you're supposed to be working on behalf of the administration or the government. Applied to the school context, it gets a little tough because we want our kids to think critically, and we want to have a fair exchange of ideas, but we can also see that there can be a problem of indoctrination, especially when you're dealing with very young kids. And I personally, as a parent, am worried about the indoctrination of gender ideology in public schools. I don't want that. And I think that parents, we saw before Marcus in Montgomery County, Maryland, wanted to opt out of certain ideological indoctrination that was going on in their public schools. And so it's tough because you're getting the kind of innocent exposure of young children to ideas, and you kind of just want them to learn math, learn science, and stay out of these hot political debates and leave that for conversations that can happen, especially in the home when we're dealing with minors.
And there's a second side to this coin, right? On the one hand, we know that students, you've rightly noted this, have complete freedom of expression and opinion within the classroom, but teachers don't have the same protections because they are employees of whatever institution or government has hired them. And as we've seen in recent history, that results in a kind of targeting against those who hold traditional religious worldviews.
Yes. Now, real quick, a little caveat with regard to the free speech of students. If there is disruptive speech, the school does have, especially when we're dealing with K through 12, right?
Hmm.
Not university setting, but the school does have an ability to step in, right? If speech becomes disruptive to, the educational process, they can discipline, they can, you know, shut it down. So that's an important caveat. A
Hmm.
kid that goes into a public school can't cause disruption in the classroom. But I think you do put your finger on something, Marcus, and that's the issue of kind of the disparate application of discipline of teachers. And we can learn that from the context of students. When students wanted to have Bible clubs after school using school facilities, and they pointed to the fact that tons of other secular groups could use the school facilities, they won. They won for the right to be able to have a good news Bible study after school on school grounds, in part because there was discrimination against the religious groups. And that may be what's going on. If we find that in a given situation, a teacher with Christian views, let's say, is being disciplined, but teachers with kind of more secular pro-abortion views are not, because they're sharing their opinions, and there's no kind of real reining them in, then there's a different argument that a teacher may be able to make, right? That she's
Yeah.
being discriminated against. But on the whole, the teacher is speaking for the government. And I think that the bigger challenge isn't so much questioning the legal principles, but making sure that when we go down to the community level, teachers, school boards, families kind of have a better meeting of the minds. What it is that the kids are being exposed to, what it is that everyone's agreed isn't really for the classroom. And that is the best way, kind of the prudential way, to avoid these clashes and avoid the sense that people are being silenced.
My guest has been Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, legal analyst for EWTN News, director of the Conscience Project, and she's been talking with us about U.S. case law drawing distinctions on public school teachers and the reality of free speech within the classroom. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.